Hi everyone, my name is Jihan Khattar. I'm the president of the Harvard Club in Lebanon, also known as the Harvard University Alumni Association of Lebanon. I would like to introduce our board members. They are Maha Adoura, Vice President, Rina Constantine, Secretary, Rodrigue Saab, Treasurer, and Nadine Abiakar, Member at Large. On behalf of our club, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to our very distinguished guest, Dr. Nasser Saidi, who is going to cover a very important and pressing topic, the economic crisis in Lebanon. Welcome, Dr. Saidi. Welcome, dear participants. We are very excited to welcome you to our first webinar. Dr. Habib Zaghbi, President of the Harvard Business School Club in Lebanon, would like to say a few words.
Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Okay. We can hear you.
I would like to welcome Dr. Nasser Saidi and thank him for being a guest with us tonight and taking the time for this. I would like also to welcome our board members, Mr. Jean-Marc Inja, Rania Safa, and Khalid Sinnou. As honorary president of the Harvard Alumni Association, that we call Harvard Club of Lebanon also, and as president of the Harvard Business School Club of Lebanon, it is for me a very important event tonight that we hit right on, I think, with the right timing, with this crucial and very delicate situation we're going through in Lebanon now. I will not call it dreadful, I will call it really crucial, absolutely. And this is the right time for someone like Dr. Nasser to be with us at this time, because when I met Dr. Nasser about 20 years ago, he was vice governor of the central bank, if you recall, Dr. Nasser. And,
yes.
And at that time, I wondered a little bit whether he will go into politics and if he will stay too long in there. And then shortly after that, he went to become a minister in the government. And I was thinking whether he will ever find himself in this group of people. Too long that I think he decided on his own that he does not find himself with this group, this government. And today in Lebanon, we would not have the problems that we would have today if there were a few like him. So I would like to welcome him, to hope that today we're going to have some ideas and we will all share to make our country a little bit better than it is today. Thank you, everybody.
Well, first of all, thank you all. Thanks to the Harvard Club, the Harvard Alumni of Lebanon, and really all of you for having invited me. And thank you, Habib, for the kind words. The couple of years in government were were important in that I learned how government works from the inside in Lebanon. And the time I spent at the central bank also allowed me good experience in terms of public policy and by and large how things work. So it was important in terms of lessons, and I've kept, of course, in touch close to Lebanon throughout, and including during this period. What I'd like to do with you this evening is discuss our situation. I'm not going to use too many superlatives, but clearly Lebanon is going through not just a series of crises, but is going through what I would call an existential crisis. Never in maybe the period since the First or Second World War have we had such a series of crises all coming at the same time. Of course, we've had the Civil War, and it was wrenching, it was destructive, it killed so many of our people, and so many people migrated. But this is the first time really that we're facing what is potentially the loss of our wealth and the destruction of our economic base. I prepared a few slides to help us go through. I prefer to have slides rather than just a discussion. Let's have some slides to discuss the current situation, and then let's open it up to some Q&A. So I wanted it to be a bit more structured. Let me try and find can everybody see that? Can everybody see that? Hello?
No, we cannot see the slides yet.
Not yet, Doctor.
Yes.
Yes, now, Dr. Saidi, we can see.
Okay, let me go full screen then. Can you see now? Yep. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Fine. When I was asked to talk, the title was meant to be Lebanese economy, status and future. As you can see, I chose a different subtitle of something mainly staring into the abyss, because that is where we currently stand. We're standing at the level of a precipice. And the question is, what can we do about it? Here's the agenda. I'll try to go through maybe for about 30 minutes or so. Start off with a high level in terms of what have been the macroeconomic developments over the past 10 years, because in effect, the current crises are not recent. They have been building up over the past 10 years, if not longer. I'll get into the monetary, financial, and fiscal reasons for the crisis, as well as the real reasons, i.e. those affecting the real economy. I'll then talk quickly about the government proposal and then mention a specific set of solutions that I've discussed with many groups, many people, including with people in government. This first slide shows you a snapshot of the past 3 years. This basically comes from the IMF. This is the third year that we've had negative growth, where that is GDP has been declining. And it is anticipated that in 2020, the decline could be staggering, at least 12 to 15%. That is like the Great Depression, global depression of the 1929, 1930s. Around us, our economy is collapsing. Businesses are going bankrupt and closing. Unemployment, of course, is rising very rapidly. And we've seen the black market, or the parallel market, to use a more polite term, of the lira has plummeted. Yesterday, it reached close to 4,000 Lebanese pounds per dollar. And the banking system, of course, is in deep crisis because it has lent some 70% of its assets, 75% of its assets to the government. You'll see the other point is that inflation is rapidly rising, expected to be maybe 17% and probably rising towards 30% this year. Budget deficits are very high. Last year, around 10%, 15% or more this year. And the level of debt, of course, is one of the highest in the world. I'll come back to that in a minute. And we're running large current account deficits, and the level of reserves has been declining. I'll be coming back to these issues later on. But to begin with, this is the picture of the twin deficits, the fiscal deficit as well as the current account deficit. As you can see, we've been running persistent deficits over time. Some countries run fiscal deficits, other countries run current account deficits. We've been running the twin deficits for at least 25 years, if not longer. But what does it mean when you run deficit? It means that you have to find the financing for those deficits. And the financing of those deficits basically means that you borrow. And we've been doing excessive borrowing. This gives you a snapshot since 92. We are now running one of the highest levels of debt to GDP in the world. We are second or third next to Japan and Greece, and maybe close to Venezuela. And at the same time, on the right-hand side panel, you'll see that the borrowing has been both in dollars as well as in Lebanese pounds. The majority has been Lebanese pounds. And the central bank now is the major holder of Lebanese pound debt and a growing holder of foreign currency debt. So if you look at the share of the GDP of government debt held by the BDL, by our central bank, you'll see that it's been rapidly rising. And in particular, you'll notice the inflection point starting in 2015, an acceleration in terms of the central bank borrowing on behalf of government and owning more and more of the debt. And this has accelerated over the past few years, and in particular since 2018, 2019. And at the same time, the central bank has been trying to defend an overvalued pound. You'll see in the left-hand side panel the real effective exchange rate and the nominal effective exchange rate. You'll see that those have also appreciated very rapidly over the past few years. What does that mean? It means that when your exchange rate appreciates, and particularly your real exchange rate, it acts as a tax on your exports and tends to favor imports. So it makes your current account deficit even worse than otherwise. And of course, it negatively affects your competitiveness. On the right-hand side, I'm showing the recent, over the past 1 year, how the Lebanese pound has depreciated. And of course, you've seen a very rapid depreciation of the pound, along with the decline in the reserves of the central bank, which are now net negative. In other words, the central bank owes more foreign currency than it actually has as assets, both to the banks and also to the rest of the world. But it's not just a story of a buildup of debt and deficits. It's also a story of real factors, geopolitical factors, which have also affected the Lebanese economy. We've had the Arab firestorm. I never called it a spring. It never became a spring. It was always a firestorm. And the firestorm, as you know, can go into a forest. It starts somewhere and can spread wildly. And when it's done, there may be nothing left to grow in the forest. So since 2011, across the Arab world, we've been living this firestorm, and it may reignite right now, given the low levels of growth. We've had the impact of the war in Syria, and it's not just the refugees and the displaced, but also it has meant that it has cut off access to the GCC countries, which are the main countries for our exports. And it has meant lower tourism levels. So both the Arab firestorm and the war in Syria have impacted our real economy directly. The third factor, extremely important, is the oil price. Now, we, of course, are an importer of oil. And so when the price of oil declines, it's to our benefit. It means we spend less in terms of the value of our oil imports. On the other hand, we are highly dependent on expatriates who are remitting money to the country, which went through our banks and then ended up at the central bank. So those remittances come mainly from countries in the Gulf, 60%, and then countries in Africa and other countries in the Arab world and elsewhere. And nearly all those countries are highly vulnerable to volatility of commodity prices. So in 2014, 2015, when oil prices declined and other commodities across the world declined, the level of remittances and the growth of remittances declined. So the deposit growth into the banking system in Lebanon and the liquidity, therefore, of the banking system got negatively affected. So we're directly affected by oil and commodity prices, even though we are not a producer ourselves. And that impact comes through remittances and investments that expatriates make. The final item which we need to analyze is the geopolitics. We are now caught, Lebanon is now caught in the maelstrom and in the confrontation between US and Saudi on the one side and Iran on the other. And as a result of that, this has affected trade, it's affected the foreign and direct investment into the country, as well as tourism from the GCC countries. This will also have implications for potential future aid coming to Lebanon. And I'll come back to that towards the end of my talk, because we're going to be highly dependent on aid from the rest of the world to rescue Lebanon. And it's not just those geopolitical factors and others which affected our real economy. The other point, an extremely important one, is the high cost of doing business in Lebanon. Anybody in the private sector or as an entrepreneur in Lebanon knows that it is very difficult and expensive to do business in Lebanon, and it has been deteriorating. I won't go through the slides, but it's a very well-known World Bank doing business slide. And our competitiveness, our cost of doing business has been increasing, and our competitiveness has been declining. And that, of course, hurts directly the private sector and its investment and activity. And if you look at infrastructure, that's the left-hand side panel, even compared to the Middle East and North Africa, which has poor quality infrastructure, we've got some of the poorest quality infrastructure in the world, and it has not been improving. It continues to decline. And the deterioration in the infrastructure, of course, means a negative impact on our business and its competitiveness. And of course, the other monster that we're living with, the cancer that we're living with, is corruption, widespread corruption at all levels. It is endemic. And this combination of widespread corruption and low quality of infrastructure, large, high cost of doing business, has meant that we have not attracted FDI. If you look at the foreign direct investments in the left-hand side panel, you'll see they're very low compared to the size of our economy. And much of it, of course, has just gone into real estate. Our Lebanese expatriates and other investors just go into real estate. Real estate is fine, but it doesn't create jobs. In fact, it just creates jobs for foreign workers, Syrians and others who work in the construction sector. Very few Lebanese really benefit from it. And as a result of this combination of all that, we've been losing our human capital. Look at the acceleration of out-migration of our young people who graduate and just leave the country because they have really no option. There are no jobs getting created, no growth happening in the economy, and the horizons are closed to them. So here we are right now in April 24th, staring into the abyss. We've had a sharp decline in economic activity. We're getting more layoffs and bankruptcies and insolvencies. And as a result of that, this is going to mean even further losses for the banking system. Non-performing loans will increase, and therefore it affects the viability of our banking system. On top of all those, we now have COVID-19. Now, it seems true so far that, alhamdulillah, we have not had too many, the contagion has spared us the worst of it. We haven't had too many deaths. We haven't had too many people contracting the virus. And let's hope that stays that way. But at the same time, social distancing and the like has meant that a deeper impact on economic activity. The result of the sharp contraction in economic activity, because of all the factors I mentioned before, has also meant a big decline in government revenues. People are not spending, so VAT revenues down. You have capital controls, and you can no longer import, and therefore nobody's paying, there's no customs duties arising. So the loss in revenue is easily in excess of 60 to 70% of government revenue. That means that government is no longer able to do any investment or social programs. But also, the capital controls, the fact that we've decided to restructure our debt has meant that we no longer have access to capital markets, so government cannot borrow. So it means that the central bank effectively is financing all the budget deficits and monetizing the debt. And when central banks do that, that means that you're increasing the supply of Lebanese pounds into the market. And two things happen as a result of that: acceleration of inflation and the depreciation of the Lebanese pound that we have seen and which is now accelerating. But also on top of that, the human cost is incredible. We're now talking about 50% of our population and more living in poverty. The World Bank estimates that at least 25% are living in extreme poverty. That is, they're barely able to supply themselves with food. My worry, of course, is that we could end up being in a famine situation. Something similar to what we last had in 1918, the First World War. This is the scenario we are entering into. And of course, the combination of all this means that you're looking ahead towards political and social conflagration. I think the protests that we had in October, November, of course, were a signal to our politicians to address the crises, to address our problems. They did not do so. And as a result of that, the crises are accelerating. And I believe, of course, this is going to mean that the protests are no longer going to be just protests. They're going to be a confrontation and a conflagration. And of course, the big danger is that if we continue as seems to be business as usual, then we might have a lost decade, indeed, lost decades. I've seen countries in Latin America, I've seen countries in Africa, I've seen countries in Asia also have lost decades. We should be smarter than that. We have the talent, we know what our problems are, we should be able to avoid this, but it's a danger, and I need to warn you. One of permanent economic decline, out-migration, and the destruction of our economic fundamentals. This is what is currently on the horizon. We have a new government. I'll quickly go through this timeline. So the Hariri government, they resigned in October, didn't address the economic protests or the demand of the street. The Jab government came in, but 3 months were wasted, and during that period when the banks went on holiday and shut down, that in effect was the biggest policy mistake that could have happened, because when banks shut down and close, they create a panic and people panicked. So if you want to look at one major element which led to the current crisis and made it explode, it is the holiday, the imposed shutting down of the banks for 2 or 3 weeks, with destroyed confidence. And once you destroy confidence, it's very difficult to rebuild that confidence. Confidence, as you know, lies at the base of finance and banking. And rebuilding it is what needs to happen now. But nothing has happened so far to rebuild that confidence. And then in March, the government, quite rightly so, said that it would not be honoring its debt, that it would be going to its creditors and look for a restructuring of the debt. I'll come back to that a bit later. And the central bank has taken a number of measures. Those measures, in effect, have accelerated really the crisis, and in particular the recent one, which allowed people to withdraw, but at parallel market rates, which meant that you're going to be injecting a lot of Lebanese pound liquidity into the market and leading to a further depreciation of the Lebanese pound. Earlier this month, the government proposed a reform plan. I'm not going to spend too much time. I'll mention what it is. Broadly, it is an acceptable plan. It talks about public debt restructuring because effectively government cannot repay the debt, neither in Lebanese pounds or in foreign currency. It simply does not have the resources. Of course, it's easier to pay your Lebanese pound debt, which is what's happening now, through inflation. And it inflates away the real value of the debt. So the government is proposing a public debt restructuring. Effectively, what they're talking about is a 60 to 70% haircut on the value of the debt, reducing that. And at the same time, is proposing a number of measures to accelerate or improve growth or revive the economy, rather, along with structural reforms. And much of that we already heard before. I mean, this is an agenda we've heard through SAID and Paris 1, 2, 3. The problem has always been not one of knowing or saying what the reforms are, it's always been one of implementation. We've never had implementation. The government is also proposing a fiscal reform plan, which is necessary. We need to reduce those enormously high budget deficits. So if you look at it, you've got what we call a stock problem, that is the problem of the level of the debt, which you need to reduce. But if you don't do anything about the fiscal deficits, then the debt problem comes back again, right? الحنفية مفتوحة. You have to close the faucet at the same time. So you need to reduce the fiscal deficit as well as to restructure the debt and therefore reduce the total value of the debt. Both of those have to happen at the same time. But, and here's the problem, it is the banks and the central bank that own much of the debt. In fact, the vast majority of the debt. Foreign creditors own a small part, not the majority, of some 20-25% of our foreign currency debt. Funnily enough, most people would have thought, well, we owe it to ourselves, so it should be easier to deal with. The answer is no. If you owed it to maybe the rest of the world, you could have restructured it, as many countries have done, and let foreign creditors pay the price. Here, we're going to end up paying the price. So it's not a big advantage that we own most of the debt, because it's going to mean necessarily a restructuring of our commercial banking sector, as well as restructuring of the BDL, i.e. the balance sheet of the BDL. So here's the government reform plan, 3 planks: reform the banking sector, including the BDL, fiscal reform. Obviously, the main point there is the EDL. If you look at EDL-related subsidies and how much they've contributed to debt, they've contributed easily 30 to 40% of our debt because of these continuing deficits over the years. What I find shocking really is that we know exactly what needs to be done with electricity, but then here's government, and not just the Jab government, other governments have come in and said it's going to take us 2 or 3 years. I find that incredible, because at the same time we know from various companies and others who have come and looked at Lebanon's electricity problem, the World Bank, the EU and others, all of them have told us we can build the power plants within 6 to 8 months. It does not take 2 or 3 years. So here is a political economy problem. It is not a technical problem. So we should be able to deal with electricity and remove it off the table, in my view, within 6 to 8 months, 1 year. And there are a number of other reforms that have also been mentioned, which we all know. So I won't spend more time on that. I want to come into a number of proposals I'd like to discuss, and then really open it up for our discussion. But just to mention the size of what we need to do. The central bank has made losses because of so-called financial engineering, the bailout of the banks that happened in 2015, 2016, and also the very high interest rates it paid on deposits in order to attract foreign exchange, in order to protect the value of the pound. And losses are estimated at around $43, $44 billion at the central bank. It could be much higher. Then the government debt restructuring on the right-hand side, maybe 67% reduction in the haircut, the value of the debt, along with the economic crisis and the non-performing loans that the banks now have, which are also rapidly increasing, means that, and this is according to government, these are numbers advanced by government, the total losses are about 83 billion in the banking system for the banks. Their capital base is around 21 billion. So net impairment of liabilities or losses that they have to face is of the order of 62 billion. So this is basically what we're talking about. So what do we need to do? How do we face that? Let me take these, and let me also say that I'm not as pessimistic as what I've shown you. I think there are solutions. And we know what the solutions are. It is not impossible. It can be done. So let me mention what the elements are of that solution. The first element is to look comprehensively. You cannot just look at the central bank or the banks and the public debt. No, you have to look at all the problems I mentioned. That is, you have to deal with the economy. You need to put in place a national, macro, fiscal, financial, banking, and currency reform plan. It has to be multilaterally funded, by which I mean we're going to need external funding for this plan. We cannot fund it ourselves. I call it an economic stabilization and liquidity fund and program for the region. It necessarily, and I insist on that, will need to come under the aegis or under the leadership of the IMF. We need to prepare it, but the funding needs to come through the IMF and other countries that are maybe willing to help us. I estimate this at around $25 to $30 billion. This would be to help us in terms of the balance of payments and allow us to import, which we can't do right now, If you cannot import, then the private sector cannot work. Our industry will shut down. We'll have to provide some central bank swaps of currencies. Countries that want to help us, such as the countries that participated in SED, can offer us debt guarantees, which would help us restructure the debt. So for example, if you look at the public debt that we have, we could repackage it and issue new debt for longer periods of time at very, very low interest rates with a guarantee from the countries that would want to help us. This would be one way of removing a large part of the debt burden and of the debt service. At the same time, this macro package also needs to provide for SSN, social safety net. That is critical, and I'll come back to that in a bit. But it also is intended to provide funding for the private sector through private equity and public-private partnerships, as well as to provide for infrastructure. So if you wish, this is like CEDR 2, but a much bigger CEDR 2 and totally redesigned CEDR 2. Second element, of course, and this is the core, you need to have fiscal reform. We need to restructure our public sector. It's not just EDL. We need to reduce the cost of doing business. We need to collect taxes. We need to reform the government procurement system. We cannot afford the pension systems that we have. And the civil service pay package that was approved by government in 2017 was fiscal harakiri. We cannot continue to pay what we're paying in terms of salaries and pensions. That is totally unsustainable. In addition to that, I estimate that 10 to 15% of public sector employees are simply not there. They're ghost workers. They're people who are still somehow collecting salaries, but they've died. They've migrated to Europe, Canada, and elsewhere, but somebody's collecting a salary. Then you have all the others who are still listed on the rostrum. They collect, or somebody collects for them, but they don't come to work. So my estimate is that 10 to 15% simply are not there. And there are ways of addressing this, and I'm happy to discuss a very simple way to reduce that practically to zero. So the fiscal reform is about the Hanafi, about the faucet, closing the faucet. But also you need to restructure the debt, as we said, the haircut. And potentially you could convert some of the debt into Lebanese pounds. Fourth element, we need to move in terms of reform of exchange rate policy and monetary policy. Monetary policy became indistinguishable from fiscal policy because the central bank kept financing government deficits. The net result of which the central bank owns a lot of debt that is worthless. It owes money to the banks, it cannot pay them because it's sitting on an asset which is worthless. That has to stop. We need to respect the money and credit code. I think we need to reform it. It says there are strict limits to how much the central bank can finance government. We need to come back to that. No more quasi-fiscal operations. No more subsidies through the back door. No more government financing. And at the same time, if you want to have an independent monetary policy, then you need to move to flexible exchange rate. You cannot have an independent monetary policy and at the same time current account, capital mobility, and all the rest. It simply does not work. Fifth element, we know that we've got many state-owned and government-related enterprises. They're totally inefficient. It goes all the way from EDL to telecom to transport, water, ports, airports, the casino, you name it, tobacco and tobacco, Middle East Airlines. These can be income-generating assets. The best way to do so is to move them out of the ministries and the central banks to prevent political interference, put them under an independently managed, professionally managed central sovereign wealth fund with people hopefully who are not political appointees. I know this is difficult, but it's feasible. Other countries have done so. Once you do that, then you can also use the sovereign wealth fund for potential oil and gas revenues in the future. And these are not going to be immediate. It's not before maybe 7 or 8 years, but we can structure it. The most important thing is to improve the governance, the efficiency and productivity of all those assets so that they can provide services to the private sector, to households, to us. And at the same time, if we decide to go for PPP or privatization, the Sovereign Wealth Fund can prepare those entities for that. Sixth item is economic and financial governance. If you have these entities, the SOEs and GREs, state-owned enterprises and government-related, they need to be independently regulated. You can't have a minister at the same time administer policy, execute, and at the same time regulate the entities. That does not work. So we need to have these independent regulators in the banking and financial industry, telecoms, oil and gas, etc. Banking sector recapitalization and restructuring is going to be at the core. The banks are trying to refuse that by saying, well, let's have a bail-in of the depositors, or at least some people are proposing the bail-in of depositors. The bail-in of depositors, i.e. having a haircut on deposits, will effectively mean, in my view, that nobody will want to remit any more money to Lebanon. But on top of that, this is our own money. In particular, this is money of several generations of Lebanese who have worked in the diaspora in Africa, the Gulf countries and elsewhere, and who remitted their money. That sort of tax would mean that it's an enormous wealth tax, and there are other solutions. The first thing that you want to do is to have a bail-in by the shareholders of the banks. This is how it should normally happen. You start off by having a cash injection by existing shareholders or new shareholders. You can capitalize the reserves. You can sell foreign subsidiaries, branches, and investments that they have. They sit on a lot of real estate of clients that they took in lieu of debt that can be sold. They can revalue their own real estate assets. And all of that, I think, can bring in probably around $20 billion. You will still need 10 billion from the rest of the world in terms of foreign financing. Two other elements, and then I'll stop and then we can talk. Point number 8 is the critical one. This is a social safety net. We cannot allow for 50% of our citizens or our people to live in poverty. We need to help them. The World Bank has estimated that we're going to need something like $800 million to create a reasonably adequate social safety net. That is part of the previous package, which I mentioned, also 25 to 30 billion that Lebanon will require. And the final item, I think, is anti-corruption. I know there are many other issues. Happy to discuss them in terms of politics, in terms of elections, in terms of all sorts of judicial reform and everything else. I'm aware of that. I just want to strictly focus at this stage on the core issue of banking, finance, the currency, and fixing our fiscal problem. But this last item is an important one, which is anti-corruption and stolen asset recovery. Here you have really two elements. The anti-corruption program is internally oriented, i.e. you bring in a special prosecutor, you empower the special prosecutor, you make sure, of course, that he's honest or she's honest, and you let them loose. and they are protected. The second one is external, and this is the STAR initiative, the Stolen Asset Recovery Initiative, which is an initiative between the World Bank and UN Office on Drugs and Crime, which has helped many countries retrieve stolen assets. So this is for the external part. What we need to do is both parts, internally and also externally. So 9 items, I think, on the agenda. I will say that I remain optimistic. What I mean by that is that we have the competence, we have the people who know how to get all this program done. And it's something I've discussed with many groups. As you know, there are many groups involved in the protests and others who are trying to move things forward. So this is feasible. The linchpin, however, is this need for external finance. We're going to need that. And that means a choice has to be made. What is the future of Lebanon? Is the future of Lebanon lost decade or decades? Or one in which we say, these are the elements of the program. This is what needs to be done. These are the reforms. We're going to need foreign assistance. Now, when we talk about this foreign assistance, this 25 to 30 billion I talked about, much of that will part of that will come from the IMF, World Bank, EIB, EBRD, and governments. We'll need to tap the EU, hopefully US, China, Japan, Korea, and others. But the GCC countries are going to play the most important part. However, the GCC countries and all the others, nobody is going to be providing a 1 cent for Lebanon if they don't see reforms happening and if there isn't a credible program and one which is sustainable, such as what I showed you in these 2 slides. Second, there's a political issue, right? The GCC countries are going to say, well, are you going to be protecting our investments? Are you going to be protecting our money? And where do you stand? So the political issue will come up. We need to face it. So this is where we currently are. Happy to discuss. I'm not sure who's handling the questions now, the Q&A.
I am, Nasser, I will be helping with the questions. I've sent you on the chat few questions that we have received earlier.
It's a long list. There's one which I know many people are concerned about. This is the issue of personal deposits. Okay. When I put out the bank restructuring plan, if you looked at the numbers, the banks effectively have lost all their equity, right? So we need to rebuild that equity. But it has to start with the shareholders of the banks, because the shareholders have been the major beneficiaries of the so-called financial engineering and the bailout and the high level of interest rates that they've gotten paid on deposits at the central bank. So what we're talking about is recapitalization around 22 billion, which I think is feasible by the shareholders and the banks themselves. You might need a top-up amount, maybe about 10 billion on top of that. That can come maybe from the rest of the world. Yeah, that can come from the rest of the world. If you have a credible plan for reform, then you will attract foreign investors. You can also create what's called a bad bank. Yeah, not a bad bank for the whole economy, as some countries did, United States, UK, and others. No, you could have a bad bank. You pass a bad bank law, which allows each bank to put aside bad loans, which might even include some of the public debt and central bank debt. So coming around to private sector deposits, this way you would avoid the large haircut on deposits that some people have been proposing. Maybe at the end of the day, if there's a shortfall, you might want to tap the 1%, in fact, this half of 1% of the largest depositors that have been major beneficiaries. So you do it in a staggered way, yeah? And by the way, of course, not everybody who has large deposits has earned it illegally. We have many people, entrepreneurs and others, who have accumulated fortunes elsewhere and, unfortunately for them, put those in Lebanon. So we should not penalize them. So there may be a contribution. The aim should be for that contribution by depositors to be the lowest percentage possible. There are many questions. So how do you like us to proceed?
If you can go one after the other.
One after the other, we selected them. First one first, second, by order.
Yeah, I see about 15, 20. Let me see. How much time do you have?
We're just getting started. There are 40 other questions waiting.
No, as many as you can, basically. You handle.
Okay, let me try to. Okay, let me go back. One question about the gold reserve. Yes, the gold is there. It has not disappeared. We should not touch it, except under a comprehensive plan, and only if you restructure the central bank and it stops doing quasi-fiscal operations and becomes a central bank like other central banks in the world, right? So nobody should be able to tap that. That should be reserves for the central bank to conduct monetary and exchange rate policy. Outlook for the exchange rates. We've already seen a large depreciation. If business continues as usual right now, by which I mean that the central bank finances government. In effect, government has very few revenues nowadays. It means that you're printing money. It means that you're printing Lebanese pounds to finance government, and that just goes into the market. It means continuing depreciation of the Lebanese pound. And that could become a runaway depreciation of the Lebanese pound. That's why you need to start with this reform plan as quickly as possible. Beginning of negotiations are now taking place with the IMF. I'm pleased to hear. Let's accelerate those. But it also means you need a courageous government. You need a government that is willing to reform. And unfortunately, you also need a parliament that is supportive. I would have wished for the Hassan Diab government to have extraordinary powers, to be given extraordinary powers, because that's what you need in circumstances like these, in times of crises. Unfortunately, they did not get that. But I think if I'm sitting in Prime Minister Diab's shoes, I would turn to the politicians and tell them, this is what needs to be done. And I'm willing to do so. If you don't do that, then you have Saidi's abyss. This is the abyss that you're looking at. So if we cannot go ahead and resolve these issues and get the reforms, I'm going to quit. It's Ashraf. It's more honorable for him to say, thank you very much. This is what needs to be done. We need to appoint competent people to the central bank, the vice governorship, to the Banking Control Commission, to the CMA, and all the other authorities which are now missing for electricity, telecoms, and all the rest. We have the people. You know, I'm sure I could go through the Harvard alumni and I could fill the central bank, EDL, telecoms regulatory authority, and everybody. We know how to do it. So, but you have to have the courage. You have to get up there and say, this is the reality. We're willing to address that. If you don't let us, then we will resign and you bear the consequences of that. Let's see. We discussed the outlook. There's one question about implementation, that it would take years to implement. Some things can happen. Some things can happen quickly. Others, the program that I mentioned is a 3-year program. It's a 3-year program. The most important point is that you agree what the program is. You agree what the series of reforms are. Public sector reform, central bank reform, public debt, etc., etc. These are on the table. Everybody agrees them. You get the foreign funding. Once you do that, by the way, it is likely that the value of the debt improves, right? Because people will see that they are likely to be paid in the future. But if you don't have a program, then there's a total loss of confidence. If you do have a program, then the value of the assets, i.e. public debt and other, increases. And so does the value of the state-owned assets, government-related assets, etc. So yes, it's going to take time. And yes, in the best of worlds, I would have had immediate elections. But we just saw a parliament refuse that, just like they refused to abolish banking secrecy. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the politicians that we have. On the other hand, if you look at the scenario as the scenario of the abyss, you might have social revolt. Things can become violent, and we've seen that in other countries. I hope we don't get there, but we might be going towards that scenario. So yes, it's going to take time. We don't have a lot of time on our hands, but I believe that we could have on the table the points I discussed, an outline with the numbers, the macro fiscal. This has already been worked on, yeah, by the way. So I don't have any secrets. I'm not, by the way, I'm not advising anybody. I'm not being paid by anybody. None of that, neither by government nor by banks or anybody else. But my understanding is that, yes, the program that I mentioned or outlined is being discussed in terms of the numbers and what needs to be done. So again, what you need is the courage to say, let us go ahead and implement it. So I think 2 to 3 years. Look, there's this issue of infrastructure spending and other reforms. Yes, nobody's going to give Lebanon any money if we don't have the reforms. But at the same time, I know from several governments that they're willing to help Lebanon. Let me give you an example. And these are serious numbers and serious proposals because I've discussed them. We have a need to import electricity, much of import fuel. Basically, a lot of that goes for electricity. There are governments that I know that are willing to provide fuel for Lebanon that would cut down our import bill very substantially. And today's prices are the lowest we've seen in 30 years. But at the same time, offer you facility for payment over 3 to 5 years. That removes close to $3 billion from your external financing needs. At the same time, those governments have told me, if you allow us into the power sector, we will build it ourselves. We will build it ourselves. What that means, of course, is that we would cut off all the corruption and waste and bribery that comes with that. And the same is true for other sectors. So again, at the core, we need to deal with corruption. We have many countries and donors that would want to help us. I am optimistic concerning that. There will be conditionality, of course. Who would want to give money to one of the most indebted countries in the world with a lot of corruption? But I guess this is where we need, as citizens, need to rise up to the occasion. You're Harvard graduates, you're Harvard alumni, you're in the Harvard Club, etc., etc. You are part of an elite, an intelligentsia that needs to have its voice heard. You need to get out there. I know that some of you do. I know that Habib, for example, does that. But more of you need to do that. Get your voice heard. Join these civil action groups that we have. I support Kulluna Irada, to give that example. I'm involved in other groups on the ground. So this is where you have to be active, because as I mentioned right at the beginning, we're facing an existential threat. It's not just a crisis. Many countries go through crises. Many countries have to restructure their debt. Many countries have to devalue their currency. But here we've got a combination of crises, yeah? Debt, currency, external, all coming at the same time in a very corrupt world. But they cannot continue. This is the point of saying this is the abyss. They cannot continue kicking the can down the road, because the net result of that is a total destruction, and they get destroyed alongside that. So at least I'm still optimistic.
I believe Jihan had a question. Jihan, would you like to?
There are many of them, so.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, hi. Do you think that the current world economic crisis caused by the coronavirus will reduce our chances of obtaining foreign financial aid or assistance?
That's a good question. Let me take it in two parts. One part has to do with the IMF. The IMF has recently set up a rapid financing initiative that is to help countries that are facing the COVID crisis. And already something like, I think 70 countries have, if I'm not wrong, have applied to the IMF to benefit from that. Lebanon could benefit from that alongside, but it would have to come also with the other reforms that are required. So the crisis from that point of view, COVID, will help us, at least in terms of the IMF and other donors. EIB, EBRD, and others. However, where you might have a problem is in terms of donors, countries, particularly the Gulf countries now, which are having unprecedented budget deficits, so with the low oil prices. So there, I think it'll be more problematic. Again, I would say that although the numbers look large, we're talking about 25, 30 billion, on a global basis, they're not that big. They're not that big. If we have a convincing story, it is that we have a credible and sustainable program, then I think we can bring people around the table. And remember, this is not money that has to come on the table immediately. No, it is a program over a number of years. So you can space it, you can get it over a number of years. So yes, COVID might make it more difficult for some countries to provide or to assist or support, but I think a lot depends on the case you make.
So, Dr. Nasser, I will go over a few questions which we have received.
Mm-hmm.
I will try to pick as much as I can. So you mentioned that the plan is acceptable. However, the plan talks in depth about many things, but only brushes very quickly on restructuring government institutions beyond EDL, tackling corruption, leakages, and informal economies, and issuing the laws that to provide transparency. Are those on the government agenda?
The short answer is I don't think they're yet on the government's agenda. This is why I mentioned the point about courage, that you have to be courageous. This is a time at which you have to stand up. You have to stand up in Parliament, you have to stand up elsewhere and say things as they are. But everybody knows these problems. So what you need to do is to have one CBM, as we call them, yeah, a confidence building measure. You have to start at least with one institution and get that right, clean it up. An easy one might be telecoms. Yeah, it is not as problematic as, say, EDL or others. But just choose one of them and work on that. Telecoms might be the easiest one. So if you start with one, you start cleaning it up. You establish these regulatory authorities. You pack them with good people from Harvard. I think you can start getting things done. It's an uphill struggle. Remember that what you're fighting against is an inherited, corrupt political class that has been unfortunately ruling us since the end of '92. So we should have no illusions. We should have no illusions, and I don't have any illusions. But all I know is that we should no longer just be thinking for ourselves. We should be thinking of our children, our grandchildren. What Lebanon are we going to leave them with? It is no longer about us. Most of us are adults. You've had your career path. You know where you're heading, or hopefully. It's about our children and our young people who are migrating and leaving, and they see no prospects. I have 3 children. My daughter is in Hong Kong. She's happily married. She's a clinical psychologist with a PhD from LSE. She's got no work in Lebanon. I have 2 sons. They're both in Switzerland. One of them is a banker, and the other one is into sports management. Again, the one who was a banker was working in Lebanon, but there was no horizon. I mean, it was limited. I mean, what do? You collect deposits, and then you go place them at the central bank. What a life for a banker. That's not what a banker should be doing. You should be focusing on the private sector, productive activity and investments, helping the economy grow. That's not what's happened over the past 10 years, unfortunately. The other guy is into sports management. So he's saying, well, again, what future do I have in Lebanon? So this is the problem, is that we're getting an older society in Lebanon. And by the way, this is a major issue for our national, for our pension systems, for our social security. It's been emptied, as you know. It's getting into negative cash flow. And it's going to get hit, because if you're going to restructure the government debt, then effectively you're wiping out most of its assets. So that has got to be addressed as well. So the issue to me is no longer us, it's what we do for future generations. And that really should really force us to get up there and be much more active.
Dr. Nasser, we have a question about transitioning the economy to a productive economy, and what do you think the concrete steps that need to be taken in this direction?
Well, it has to start with the bank restructuring. If you look at the balance sheet of the banks, 70% of their assets, nearly 75% of their assets, are government debt and central bank debt. Yeah. The rest is private sector loans and credits. That's way too little. So what you need to do is to clean up the balance sheet of the banks to make space for private sector lending and financing. And at the same time, you need some foreign financing. I know from the EIB, the EBRD, the Islamic Development Bank, and others, that they would be willing to come in to provide financing for the private sector. There's something also called the Arab Monetary Fund up in Abu Dhabi. They provide financing for imports of Arab countries from other Arab countries. We can tap a lot of that to help the private sector. So over 2 to 3 years, you clean out the balance sheet of the banks, create more space for the private sector, and you get some facilities from the rest of the world.
Dr. Habib, would you like to jump in?
Yes. Dr. Nasser, this is Habib again.
Yes.
I have a question concerning the central bank, since you have a lot of experience with this institution. We discussed a lot about restructuring commercial banks as part of the total restructuring. There's been many ideas, but very few ideas have touched on the central bank itself and what's inside this institution, which is still very unknown to many of us. The first time we heard about the big loss that they had was the 44 billion that Lazard brothers discovered, actually. And that's about 3 weeks ago. This is the first time a real number was placed. So with 44 billion with the central bank, I wonder whether there are ways to restructure this place by, for example, giving shares in the central bank to commercial banks against the debt that the commercial banks have given, this total of 75 or 80 billion debt, besides the foreign reserves that the central bank has for them. If part of it could be shares, like I've seen in some countries, and since the central bank has a seniority priority about making money over time, they can pay them back over time, over the years, because it is more safe than something else.
Yes.
Other possibilities of restructuring, I'm sure you can suggest and know, because nobody talked very much about that and about the issues related to the transparency of the central bank and the productivity of it. And that's, I think, a subject that's going to be talked about very much in the next couple of months. And I wish to have very much your ideas about this.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And by the way, I have discussed what you just mentioned, namely a case in which the shares, the central bank has shares, okay? You take the example of Switzerland. Swiss National Bank is a publicly listed bank. It's listed on the exchange, on the Zurich exchange. So it has shareholders, not just banks. Anybody can buy Swiss National Bank shares. However, the shareholders don't interfere in monetary policy. Monetary policy is set by the governor or the president of the Swiss National Bank without the intervention of the shareholders. They pay dividends over time because of seigniorage and other profits. So yes, that is a potential model, and I've discussed this. I've tweeted about it a couple of times. Twitter seems to be a favorite way of getting around to politicians nowadays. So it could be done in a way that you list shares of the Lebanese central bank on the exchange. However, seigniorage benefits or seigniorage income may not be sufficient. So what you might need to do is to bring in an injection of equity. I think an injection of equity of about 5 to 10 billion should be sufficient. Remember that many of these accumulated losses, the counterpart of those really are losses for the banks, right? But those losses accumulated because of the high interest rates that the central bank was paying on deposits of the banks, right? If you're paying 17, 18, 20% and more on bank deposits, well, what is it that the central bank could have been doing to pay 17 to 20%? So this is where the origin of a lot of the losses came about, through the so-called financial engineering and other operations, as well as subsidies for many activities, the various types of loans which got subsidized. Normally, these things are done by governments. It is not the business of the central bank to provide subsidized lending. Yeah, leave that for Syria and other countries that have state-dominated banks and central banks. So the central bank should get out of the business of providing doing quasi-fiscal operations and subsidies. So to resolve the issue of the central bank, you're talking effectively about the CDs. The CDs themselves need to be restructured. So you put them maybe on a 10, 15, 20, 30-year basis, okay, with a very, very low interest rate. So they remain on the balance sheets of the banks, okay, but they earn a very low interest rate on them, and you extend the maturity, yeah. The other issue, of course, is the portfolio, the BDL portfolio of government bonds and other treasury bills and euro bonds and the rest. So you're going to have to write down the value. The central bank is going to get a hit. And again, you need to amortize that. You'll need to amortize that over time with an equity injection. At the same time, the way I would approach it, because there's also an issue, it's not just simply a balance sheet issue of profits and losses. There's also an issue of liquidity. So the way to address that is to organize some central bank swaps, i.e. You go to the countries that would want to help Lebanon. We would organize a swap of our currency versus their currency to provide us with access to foreign exchange. That could be done with a number of hopefully friendly central banks. Once you do that, you shore up the reserves of the central bank through these swap operations, provides liquidity, and then you can get the wheels going again. You restore confidence gradually. So there are several ways to do it. One way is to mutualize the central bank, and there are examples, and one of the best ones is the Swiss National Bank. There's no reason why we should not be talking about that. Of course, people will jump up and say, but you're privatizing the central bank. Well, no, you're not privatizing the central bank. You're mutualizing the central bank, i.e. you're allowing everybody to participate in the central bank, but they do not interfere into central bank policy. And you have an equity injection, hopefully with other countries helping us, and the central bank swaps that I mentioned. So it is feasible.
Dr. Nasser, I have a few questions. I'm catching up a few questions from the chats, and interestingly, the question I see here is, how can you be optimistic that the same people who created the mess will fix it?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, I'm not. And you need change, of course. We should have no illusions about that. And I think there was a question a bit earlier about transparency and disclosure, and I think Habib was pointing to that. All our institutions, starting with government, starting with the central bank, have got to publish their accounts. Those accounts have got to be audited by a respected party. The results of the audited accounts should be made public. I'm in favor, for example, of our establishing a parliamentary budget office, like the Congressional Budget Office in the United States, which is an independent body that scrutinizes the budget and any laws and others that come. We need this public scrutiny. So I would be in favor, and I have a project for establishing a parliamentary budget office that would look at every single law that passes or comes to Parliament and judges what its fiscal and budgetary implications might be. So we need to insist for all these institutions, Middle East Airlines, the casino, telecoms, all of that need to start publishing their results so we can look and see what's happening. Once you do that, I think there's nothing like light to uncover where the cockroaches are. Yeah. Once you start putting that light out, and there are audits, and then not only the audits, but there's then accountability. Okay, then you start cleaning up, and of course, I'm always reminded. I always use a German proverb, which I use frequently. I do a lot of work on corporate governance. And this German proverb says, if you want to clean the stairs, you start at the top. You don't clean the stairs at the bottom. You start at the top and then you clean downwards. Again, what this means is a lot of courage. What it means basically is that all of us have got to push for elections as early as possible. We need to make sure that whatever electoral law comes up does not reinstate the same people we want to see out of power. But it also means that you've got to become activists. You've got to get out into the street. What happened in October, November, December was very encouraging. It lifted one's heart. And I know people will go back to the street. But all of you have got to be much more engaged. And it means eventually, once we have elections and we need to start preparing for them now, you're going to have to provide funding and support for the people who are going to challenge. Not easy, but that's what we have to face. It's been since 92, 93. You have to undo it.
Hopefully we can do something. Actually, the next question is connected to this. We have an idea of making a digital platform that enables all the Lebanese diaspora to vote, so we can have a new foundations for the political system. Do you think that could be something that we can dream about?
You mean vote in Parliament? Vote in Parliament.
The platform that will connect all the Lebanese.
Yes.
To be able to vote.
You mean for Parliament, for public office?
Yes.
Yeah.
Parliament elections.
I'm an economist, so I'm happy to give you the right to vote, but you're also going to have to pay your taxes, right? You have to contribute. You have to contribute something. So I don't think that it is just a freebie that you provide. If you're going to vote, and we should allow Lebanese expatriates to vote, but they also have to be concerned citizens and taxpayers. I think that the two go together. So yes, by all means, but let's look at the consequences of that in terms of the involvement of our Lebanese expatriates and citizens into political life. It's not just a matter of voting. Let them come in and be active. If you're going to create a platform like that, get them to start financing projects. I'll give you a couple of examples. I've seen them in the past few months, the past few weeks. There are a number of bankers, my type of bankers, that have been putting together funds for industry, you know, and telling people, let's use your deposit, come into this fund, which will then go into Lebanese manufacturing and industry. Private equity is another one. So let's get our Lebanese expatriates involved, both politically but also economically.
So one more question. Can we prevent PEPs from acquiring shares in sovereign wealth funds?
In what sense? Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. The PEPs, yes. Well, the sovereign wealth fund that I mentioned is not for participation by citizens or PEPs. So this is a sovereign wealth fund. You transfer many of those state assets into the sovereign wealth fund. And then when you have oil and gas revenues, those also go into the sovereign wealth fund, okay? The role of the sovereign wealth funds is to make sure those state-owned assets are well governed, well managed, and they generate income, which then goes into treasury, part of which goes into a treasury, into the Ministry of Finance. You establish a rule for that. But you're not participating in the sovereign wealth fund. It belongs to the state, but PEPs or others would not participate in that. Later on, once you've cleaned out those state-owned enterprises, you've made them efficient, they may become candidates for public-private partnerships, they may become candidates for privatization. I think that's the road in which we should be heading. When I think of many countries in which I've lived, particularly now in the Gulf, I see a lot of public utilities that are run extremely well, very efficiently. You take an Emirates Airlines, it's run like a private company. It does receive support, but it runs very efficiently, and so many of them. So what we need is efficiency in terms of the management and running of those state-owned enterprises and government-related enterprises.
Okay. What do you think we should do with the gold? That's the question.
The gold would be part of central bank restructuring. Remember that there's a law which was passed at the time of the Jumayyah presidency, yeah? That prevented any dealings with gold because they wanted to prevent potentially gold being used to finance arms. So Parliament passed a law then that prevented any dealings with gold, and that is the situation. So you cannot even put it on deposit. But it is an asset. It can be an earning asset, and it should become an earning asset. But you should only free it if you put strict rules for the central bank, i.e. you forbid the central bank from financing government. Yeah? You say, thou shalt not finance government. Yeah? You do a German model. Yeah? And you tell government, I'm not there to finance you. If you want to get financing, go to the markets. And that's where you get financing, or go to the banks, negotiate with them, but don't come to me. So, short answer is the gold can be used as part of a restructuring of the central bank. It is an asset. but at the same time, there should be conditionality. We need to make sure that the central bank is well governed. So I'm, for example, in favor of putting a supervisory board for the central bank, like many central banks. Otherwise, you have an executive board, but then you have a supervisory board. Again, this is the German model. The supervisory board makes sure that the executives do their job. They're in charge of running the bank, but the supervisory board sets policy. So I think we should be heading in that direction.
Okay. How do you think the confidence in the banking system will be restored?
Well, you can only restore it, in my view, if you have this comprehensive plan that we discussed. Why a comprehensive plan? Because you need to address the three balance sheets: the balance sheet of the government, balance sheet of the central bank, the balance sheets of the banks. Those are, as we know, interlinked. So the banks' confidence in the banks is linked to how you restructure government, the state, and the central bank in order to make them productive assets in which the banks have invested. At the same time, within this 3-year program that we talked about, you would be gradually removing capital controls. As long as you have capital controls, it'll be very difficult to restore confidence, because Lebanese expatriates and the diaspora will not feel confident transferring back their money if there are capital controls. So this is why you need this comprehensive plan, which says that maybe over 3 years, you might have the capital controls, but, and here's the difference, many countries that have imposed capital controls did so under a law. You have a capital controls law, and then you have to justify every 6 months why you need to maintain the controls. Yeah. So whether it's the Ministry of Finance or a central bank which is imposing those capital controls, they have to justify why they should continue with those controls. But again, this is within a program. And if you do that, I think you will restore confidence gradually.
It will be a difficult journey.
Of course.
How do you think the abyss will be? Optimistically speaking, how long do you think the abyss will be?
I think we can move out of our problems gradually over a period of 3 to 5 years. Yeah? 3 to 5 years. I think that's perfectly feasible. However, the longer you delay, and this is, I'm talking about the experience of other countries. We have a large number of countries that had to restructure. Yeah? The longer you delay, the bigger the size of the problem. And this is what's happening now. So if you don't act quickly, then your 3 to 5 years becomes 7 to 10 years. And it can be longer. This is why you run the danger of a lost decade or decades. This is why it's urgent to act quickly. Yeah. But yes, wow. I'm optimistic. If you get the teams in, you negotiate with the IMF, negotiations are ongoing. You stop all this political wrangling and haranguing, talking about the IMF as though it were some monster. It is not a monster. Many countries have gone through a program. The program that is being discussed with the IMF, for example, includes a social safety net, includes all the safeguards that we would want. But the truth is very simple. You need conditionality to be imposed. Unfortunately, our politicians have been irresponsible. You need somebody to impose conditions for reforms and to tell them, I'm not going to give you any money or any support until you conduct these reforms. It started with CEDR, And this is now a much bigger problem. So the only way you can force the politicians is through a program of conditionality where you tell them, yes, you can get funding. We will help Lebanon. We will help Lebanon in its problems, but these are the conditions. Because our politicians don't seem capable of taking responsibility for what they have done.
Not easily.
No.
I would like to thank you. I believe we have way past the scheduled time. I would like to thank everyone who joined us. I'd like to thank you for this session on behalf of Harvard University Alumni Association in Lebanon and the Harvard Business School. And we look forward to additional discussions in the future. As stated initially, that this session was recorded and the recording will be shared. The slides will also be shared. So with this,
thank you very much, and I'll be providing you with the slides.
Okay.
Thank you,
Dr. Nasser. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Saidi.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
And good luck to all of us.
Thank you.